Matthew.
How was your day today, Mr. Gallagher?
My day? Already, you mean so far? So far, it's been pretty good. I think you're all going to have an effect on it from here on, right? Okay, we're going to go over part of yesterday's lecture so that you take better notes. These pictures were taken in 1958 when the first Boeing 707 was at O'Hare Airport in Chicago. I had just gotten out of the Army, and I was interested in aviation at that time, very much so. So I went out to O'Hare and took a look at the 707 that was sitting there. That was the very first one ever. That's the forerunner of huge numbers of Boeing aircraft. Andrew. What did I do in the Army? I was a high-speed radio operator. You are familiar with Morse code and the keys. That's what I had to do. So I was the chief radio operator and a chief cryptographer in Germany for 2 years, and then 4 years back in the States. Okay. The growth of airlines around the world. We covered this slide yesterday, but I want you to pay attention to some of the airlines that are here, shown on the slide. Look at Air France. It's about the only country that does not have more than one local flag carrier. One of the companies that operates very much so in France and, of course, anywhere around in Europe. And if you ever go to Europe, I'd suggest you consider Ryanair. They were very much like the early days of PSA, which was called Pacific Southwest Airlines, operating in California. You used to be able to go from San Francisco to L.A. and back again, one way, $7.50. You didn't have to make any reservations. You'd go out to the airport, park your car, walk through the terminal, out the gate, and onto the aircraft. And if that aircraft was ready to go, it was filled, they'd go, and another one would come in its place. Those were the early days of low-cost travel. Well, Ryanair is doing the same thing in Europe. I flew on Ryanair from Dublin to Bergamo, Italy. And I think it cost me like $17 one way. It's just a phenomenal airline. Now, you get packed in like cattle, but at least it gets you there, and it gets you there fast and very inexpensive. But I want you to pay attention to the rest of the airlines, because these are some of the things that as you get a little bit older and you start getting into your career more and more, you're likely to be flying not only American airlines, flying airlines based in here in the United States, but you'll also be flying airlines perhaps around the world. Again, it depends a lot on you, what your career has for you in store. I would hope that all of you have an opportunity to get good enough careers so that you can travel widely, because traveling is one of those very, very important things that happen to everyone who can afford it. Because when you're in a country, especially Germany or France, Italy, Switzerland, you got a much better sense of life in general, of society, how much variation there is among people, but more importantly, how much commonality there is among people. So, be thinking in terms of the airlines themselves. Okay. Remember, I don't want you to be copying down detail unless you're interested in a particular country. And if you are, that's fine. Copy down the detail. But I'm not going to ask you a question, for example. I'm not going to say, what is the main airline in Asia? You guys want to continue talking? You want to, come on, up here. Those of you who have been talking, come up here and do the lecture. Well, you can't? Well, that's interesting. So the United States began to put nuclear weapons everywhere in the country and other places around the world by the thousands. We had more nuclear weapons than anybody in the world combined at one point in time. Russia tried to catch up. That's one of the things that caused Russia to collapse. They simply could not keep up with armaments and defense spending the way the United States was doing it, because they had no backup at all. Their budget at that point in time was probably 90% of the budget of Russia was being used for defense to try to keep up with the United States. We talked about this the other day, and that is they sectored Berlin into 3 groups. And those groups were occupied by the British, the Americans, and the Russians. At one point in time, the Russians put up a blockade. And of course, we then, using DC-3s and DC-6s, were able to overcome the blockade and be able to break the back of the Russians, so they retreated to their own sector. Here in Fresno, there's a guy by the name of John Durant, a very good friend of mine, who was involved directly in the Berlin blockade. He was one of the people who was controlling the flow of the aircraft in and out of Berlin. A fascinating guy. He's got tremendous experience, and we're happy to have him here. We're glad that he lives here, and he's able to talk about it, give presentations on his days of operating the Berlin airlift. Then there's the Korean War, another war. Here we go with another war. My cousin was involved in the Korean War. He was trapped at what is called the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea in the bitter winter. Finally, they were surrounded at that point in time by the North Koreans and the Chinese, both who were fighting in North Korea. And he was able to get out eventually. He had a lot of tales to tell about what they felt like when they were trapped at that reservoir and they couldn't get out, and they were surrounded by the enemy. Anyway, helicopters were used a lot in the Korean War, but not nearly as much as in the Vietnam War. Here's one of the aircraft. It's a terrible picture, by the way. That's the F-86 Sabre, and then this is the MiG-15, built by Russia, used in Korea. They're very, very basic jets, as you can see. Look at the intake. They were trying to direct the flow in the intake and the nose, but they were capable. At least they were something up there that we had to fight off. Vietnam. More than 57,000 died in Vietnam because every president that got involved in Vietnam kept it going because they didn't want to lose the next election, which was the most tragic way of making a decision. It would be interesting to see if every president who was in a position to either stop the war or continue it had sons and daughters who were forced to go into combat in Vietnam. I would wonder how many times the president would continue the war knowing their sons or daughters were in combat in Vietnam. I doubt very many. But here they are with no children in the battle, and it's easy for them to say, yeah, let's continue it. My brother-in-law, my wife's brother, died in Vietnam very early on. He was only over there 6 months and he was killed. Lived in Mendota, and now in Mendota they have a park named after him simply because he was the first soldier from the Central Valley killed in the Vietnam War. Daniel? I think he was 19, just 19. Well, you guys all of you here, girls and guys, are not that far away from being, first of all, being adult, and secondly, being either in combat or hopefully not. Hopefully you're going to continue an academic career for a while and then move on into a more stable career rather than having to seek out the military. Now, I can give you my suggestions if you decide you're going to go in the military, which is, of course, a good idea because the military can provide you with training, and they give you a big pot of money when you get out at the end of your first tour, which would be 4 years in the Air Force and 4 years in the Navy. When you get out, you have this money, not only a pot of money, but also the opportunity to go to college again. That's what happened to me. I went to college for 2 years, couldn't afford it any longer, went in the Army, came back out, worked for a couple of years, and then went back to school again. That's something you may have to do. I couldn't afford it because my father died when I was 6. And so there were 7 in the family, and we simply couldn't afford anything. So the suggestion is if you're going to go in service, don't pick the Marines. All the Marines are good, strong fighters, and they put them on the front lines, and they let them do all of the bloody battling. And then the Army comes along, and they're on the front lines after the Marines have moved away. Meanwhile, the Air Force are up, or they're in their beautiful air bases, and the Navy are on beautiful ships that are no longer being threatened because there are no other navies in the world as strong as the United States. So if you're in the Air Force or if you're in the Navy, your chances of being directly in battle, being shot at by somebody with a rifle, are very slim indeed. So if you want to go into the Air Force or the Navy for a career, do so. You can get taught a lot in the Navy, you can get taught a lot in the Air Force. Rockets, missiles, and satellites. This is the next step after the Vietnam War, after the air defense. We were spending tons of money to try to protect ourselves from what we thought were the Russians going to be sending missiles up over the top of the globe along the Bering Strait and down into the United States. That would have been the best way for a ballistic missile to go. So they set up what is called the DEW line. And the DEW line are letters from distant early warning. And the DEW line was there to try to pick up as quickly as possible radar of input from either ballistic missiles or bombers coming from Russia. And I remember being in radio school, and they warned us, okay, anybody that goofs off in radio school and gets bad grades, we're going to send you to the DEW line for your tour of duty. And that would have been a disaster because there's nothing up there except Army and Air Force barracks. No nightclubs, no nothing, no McDonald's. So that was an incentive for a lot of us to work very, very hard in radio school and come out with good grades. The other benefit was that the higher in the class you were, the better choice you had of where you wanted to be stationed. And so they gave us a list of, there were a couple going to Europe, there were a couple going to Atlanta, Georgia, there were a bunch of them going to Korea, a bunch of them going to Vietnam, and so they gave us this whole long list. And so those of us who had it in mind that we didn't want to be sent somewhere without our approval, we worked very, very hard to get a selection. And, of course, that all came as a result of what you're seeing now. We're talking about an era that just was after I, in fact, wound up serving in the service. At the time, they had to develop things like supercomputers. Well, of course, the supercomputers in those days were rooms bigger than these rooms, and they were vacuum tubes. In fact, for a long time, for a ridiculously long time, the FAA had computers in every control tower that were based on cathode ray tubes or radio tubes, which produced a huge amount of heat. So early in the days of computers, the computer rooms had false floors, right, for all the big, huge cabling that went between the computers. And they also had huge duct work in the ceilings so that the air conditioning unit could keep the room at least reasonably cool, because the computers in those days gave off huge amounts of heat. Well, finally, in transistors, it turns out, lucky for me, that I happened to be at the top electrical engineering college in the United States at the University of Illinois at Champaign. And there with the gentlemen were developing the transistor as well as one of the earliest computers. The earliest computers, I believe, was the ENIAC, electrical, numerical, integrated something or other. And then the University of Illinois developed the ILIAC, ILLIAC, and it was during that time when the gentlemen, the faculty of the University of Illinois Electrical Engineering program were developing the transistor. So I was in school in electrical engineering studies during a time when they were just after discovering the transistor and then developing ways in which the transistor could be used, modified, and improved. That was a pretty exciting time because even though I was not specializing at transistors at the time, it was interesting because the faculty, everywhere the faculty were, whether they were in our classrooms or whether they were in the lounges or whether they were in the cafeteria, were talking about the new developments of transistors and what they would mean for the future. So, one of the things that happens is when you get rid of a big, huge vacuum tube, which gives off a tremendous amount of heat, and it requires huge amounts of electricity, and you get a transistor that's about as smaller than your little finger's thumbnail, what an amazing difference between the two of them. So all of a sudden, as it says here, you could pack now tremendous circuitry into a very tiny area, and you could then guide ballistic missiles that way much easier. The world of electricity and electronics has grown tremendously down from massive units all the way down to microscopic units. And now we're talking about quantum computers. Anybody ever run into that word, quantum computer? That's going to be the next big thing. You're going to see developments in computers and laptops that will just blow your mind, like I've seen computers all the way down. When I first started my computer company, we had a disk called Data Products, was the company that designed it, and it was 20 megabytes. That was such an amazing thing. We could get 20 megabytes of storage. 20 megabytes is hardly a photograph now on your cell phone, right? And yet the Data Products disk was probably at least as big as that red stand-up, and it was out here about 6 feet. So it came out about 6 feet, but it was that dimension. And it would be spinning very, very fast, and it had all kinds of cooling devices inside of it. The problem with it was it wasn't all that dependable. I used them for my computer company in the business world, and what would happen is we'd write out a notation that, let's say, a case of potatoes came in a rail car in San Francisco, and we'd put out there 100 cases. The next time we'd go to find it, it might come back and say there was 110 or 80. I mean, the number of errors of reading and writing to these disks were so bad that you had to write them twice just to make sure that you were getting the right number in there. Anyway, things were happening rapidly at this time this time in the development of the defense and the history of aviation. And so, as a result of that, many, many advances could be made now because the transistor development was just rapidly going ahead, faster than anything I've ever seen in terms of where you could use it and what value it would be. Here are some of the aircraft. Boeing had the B-47, which is in the upper left-hand corner, and as you can see, it has 6 engines. It also could be modified by having JATO bottles added to the side of the fuselage between the wing and the horizontal stabilizer. And JATO bottles are simply rockets, one-time use rockets called jet-assisted takeoff, JATO. They could be attached to the side of the fuselage, as they sometimes were on the Boeing B-52. And they would be used to help launch the aircraft off the runway. So the long-range bombers, it was one of those things where we'd make a long-range bomber, we'd develop one, the Russians would copy it, and then eventually, even today, the Chinese are copying our our latest development in aviation. The Soviets actually, I don't remember what, there was some word about how the Russians came up with their design, which is exactly the same as the B-29. So there was some nickname they gave the Russian B-29. I forget what it was, but it was something pretty funny that had to do with the fact that it was directly copied from the American B-29. So this is what the B-29 looked like. A lot of these aircraft, if anybody's ever interested, and you're in a car and you can take a ride up 99, you can go to Atwater. Atwater has a lot of aircraft on display. They have a lot of bombers. They also have the SR-71 Blackbird. You can actually go up and touch the wing. You can see the leading edge of the wing. The leading edge is really sharp. They have bombers from World War II. They have a DC-9 that used to be used by the presidential parties, and it's still painted that way, and it still has the interior for the president. I believe the vice president used that one. But as you can see, here's the Russian Tu-95, which is a long-range bomber, turbocharged engines. There were turbines driving propellers, and driving propellers that, as I recall, each engine had two sets of propellers driving in opposite directions. I'm not sure about the airflow. It may have been a torque situation where they wanted to avoid torque, because when you have one single propeller going around, it tends to pull on one side only, because when the propeller comes down and starts up again, and you're in an aircraft, it's developing more lift there than when it goes over on the other side and starts going down again. So you're getting more lift on the right side of a rotating propeller than you are on the left side, which would be the downside. That's one of the things you learn when you're flying small aircraft. You learn about the torque and about the fact that the airplane has a tendency when you're climbing to go off to the left because of the fact that the upward moving propellers are generating more lift. Wernher von Braun, who was the top German scientist and developer of the V1 and the V2, especially the V2 because it was a ballistic missile, came over to this country. He was captured and brought to this country, actually. He wound up being here successfully and being here happily. He never wanted to go back to Germany. He's the one that developed our program of accelerating rocket technology. So, again, here we are with a weapons race. We were developing ballistic missiles, so were the Russians. They were getting one, then we'd get one better, then they'd try to catch up to us, then we'd get a better one. And the amount of money being spent by us and the Russians was appalling. We never should have spent that kind of money, because what was happening was we in our country kept saying, oh, the Russians have more than we have, the Russians have more than we have. Well, when the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union, when that fell, when that collapsed, we had access to all of their personal information, and it was discovered that they weren't ever anywhere near close to us in the development of missiles and nuclear warheads. We were so far ahead of them, but somehow or other, they introduced fake information, like they might have during this last election. They introduced fake information that filtered down to us into our intelligence agencies, making us believe that they were right up there with us, or at least a little bit ahead, which then drove our development. There's two crazy countries out trying to out-develop one another and lying to one another and sending off wrong information. It was just crazy. Anyway, the Russians did, in fact, beat us to space. They put up Sputnik, and I was certainly around at that point in time. And I remember it scared everyone because, number one, it was the Russians who put it up there. Number two, no one could understand what might now happen with that satellite going around the Earth. Everybody could, if they had any kind of a little receiver at all, they could hear the beep, beep, beep of the Sputnik. And it was pretty frightening to be in this country realizing the Russians had put up the first satellite, and that it could do, who knew what it could do? Could it shoot down anything? Could it look into our facilities? Could it spy on us? I mean, nobody had any idea, and so everybody was really upset. In addition to that, of course, we were talking about making bigger and faster and better airplanes and breaking the sound barrier, and it's one of those things where, the more you work at it, the more you keep frightening yourself that you haven't done enough and you haven't developed things far enough. And I don't know whether any of you have ever tried to design or develop anything, even a little something that you could hold in your hand, but you start doing it, and then pretty soon you realize that you could have done it a better way, and then you start making changes, and pretty soon you never finish. You never complete the development of it. One of the reasons that there are companies around the United States today that are designed to help you with your inventions is because they know that if they don't get involved with you and help direct you to getting that done, that you will be developing something nearly forever. And that's really true, and it was certainly true in the days of developing longitude. Remember we talked about the fact that when the ships out of England sailed out into the oceans, they had no way of knowing where they were from a longitude point of view. They knew where they were from a latitude, but they didn't know longitude. And the guy that developed the chronometer that solved the problem of longitude, he kept making one, then he'd make a better one, and he'd make a better one, and he kept holding off submitting it to the British government because he felt like he could make it better and better and better. And so years went by in his development before he finally said, okay, I'm going to submit it. He finally wound up winning all of that money, but in the process it nearly cost him his life. So as an end to this particular lecture, and I'm going to start on another one right away, for a few minutes anyway, that should be familiar to all of you, right? Who was in that red? Chuck Yeager, right. Now I don't know whether this is the first flight or the second flight or whatever flight, or maybe it's even somewhat of an animation. I don't know. It looks realistic to me. But anyway, Chuck Yeager was, I think, the only one that ever flew the Bell X-1. Now we're moving on to space-age aviation. And in the space race, it all began with Sputnik. And Sputnik is the one that made everybody realize that space was no longer just a place out there. That it was a place we could get to, we could put things up there, they would stay up there, they could, if they had a strong enough camera, they could look down on us. And I have to tell you today, I'm sure that the Defense Department has cameras on board satellites circling the Earth that are so powerful that they can read license plates in any city anywhere on the globe, and probably more than that, because that information was released by the Defense Department. They admitted, yes, I guess we can read license plates. Well, if they can read license plates from space, can you imagine what else they can do with those cameras? And so even today, in a place like Eastman Kodak or in a place like Silicon Valley, the number of developments going on that are top secret, especially in photography, as well as in electronic photography, digital photography, the number of things going on is pretty significant. So if you're hired, for example, by one of the development companies, or like Apple or Microsoft, there are sections of those companies that you can never get into unless you've been hired into them, and then you have been cleared by the Secret Service and the FBI, because those places are extremely top secret. The developments, because the Russians and the Chinese are always trying to find a way to get in to the most secret places we have in this country. Though communication satellites and Earth observation satellites, we know that's all going on now, but at the time it seemed like a dream that you could have a satellite up there looking down and telling you what the weather was going to be like tomorrow. That's why the weather today, the weather development today is so far advanced, because we can actually see what's happening from space and we can see and develop in ways that you could never see otherwise. I have a sculpture over in the library, and it's called von Karman vortices. And they are cloud forms that nobody knew existed until we went into space. You could look down on the oceans, and you could see the cloud forms that were laying on near the water, but they were formed as a result of wind moving past an island. And if you happen to be in the library, I have 4 sculptures over there, and one of them is called von Karman vortices, and it will show you. I have a photograph that I took from space, or that I found that someone took from space. I put it next to my sculpture, so you're able to see what I'm talking about. Well, those are the kind of things that we never knew existed until we actually got into space. And of course, once you get into space and realize that you can use that as a launching point to go out in the rest of the solar system, things began to happen. The United States began to send all kinds of satellites and objects into space. One of them right now is what's the name? Is it Voyager? Voyager? Is that the one that's now out of the solar system? Yeah, so it's amazing because that's been going on for 20 years now, 25 years. It's been traveling out of the solar system, through the solar system, and now getting to the fringes of the solar system into into empty space. Well, they call it empty space, but it's really not. Hey, he's talking. Isn't it a matter of respect? Go ahead, Alberto. Pardon? There is no longer any contact with that one? I think one of the problems, of course, is the amount of power that was done so early in the space history that the amount of onboard powering that they could generate was so small. Somebody likened it to the fact that it's about the amount of energy that would be present in a tiny little LED, that those waves coming back from that far in the distance are so weak that it's very, very difficult. They're still picking it up. It may have lost contact with it by now, I'm not sure. And then here we are in the human spaceflight program. Again, we have the X-15, which was the next logical development of the Bell X-1. And the X-15 was really a very true rocket ship. It got launched off a B-29 and then a B-52. I think at some point in time they launched it under a B-52. But anyway, for the most part, a B-29. And then it would come back and it would land at Edwards Air Force Base. It had 2 skids on the back and it had a nose wheel. So when it landed with the nose very high. Remember we talked about angle of attack. If you want to slow down, you have to pitch the aircraft nose higher so that the angle of attack between the chord line of the wing and the relative wind is just below the critical angle of attack, so it wouldn't stall, but it gives you the slowest speed. And so as they're coming in for a landing, it would land on those 2 rear skids. And they look like skids on a sleigh. You know what a sleigh looks like in the wintertime, drawn with a horse? Has anybody ever seen a sleigh? Okay, well, that's what those red skids look like, the bottom of the X-15. And there was one video where the X-15 came in too hard and it hit on those skids, and when the nose slammed down, the entire X-15 broke in half. So the Mercury, Gemini, and the Apollo. Somebody talked about one of the essays that I read from somebody here in the class talked about the fact that the shuttle got us to the moon. Well, of course it didn't. It was the Apollo program that got us to the moon. The shuttles weren't even designed yet when we landed on the moon. So just keep in mind there's a big difference between the shuttle operations that you know about today and being on the moon in 1969. Remember, it was the Apollo program that took us to the moon and the shuttle that put us as a real big workhorse in space around the country. The Soviet space programs, it's very, very difficult to talk an awful lot about it because they try to keep everything secret. We as a country try to keep everything publicized around the world so that the world itself can stay with us or catch up to us or help us get ahead. The Russians, on the other hand, are exactly the opposite. They don't want anybody to know what they're doing. They don't want anybody to know the secrets of what they're trying to put together. But as it turns out, they build brutal equipment. It's really bulletproof, not very sophisticated, but it gets the job done, perhaps using twice as much jet fuel and twice as much explosives as we would if we were going to send up a rocket. But somehow or other, they simply get the job done, and here we are relying on them to carry us into space, and have been. Now, part of that is political. Part of that is political. We're trying to make sure that there's not a revolution developing in Russia, so by buying time on their space rockets, we're helping their economy. And we don't simply want to give them money like we're giving a lot of countries in the world. We want to at least let them save face by selling us information or services that we're then willing to pay for, and it helps their economy. So I can't talk much about what's going on here in the human space program because they don't want anybody to know about it. The European space development was a lot different. It turns out that here came France. France came along and was actually the third country in space. So I certainly have to hand it to them. They wanted to at least save a little bit of face by being the third country in space, even though they kind of lost what they had hoped would have been a perpetual first position in all of aviation for all eternity. But they lost that, as you all know. They lost that a long time ago. The British and the Americans took over, and even the Germans wound up having a much stronger aviation division than France did until the Airbus development, until they began to build Concordes, and then after that the Airbuses. And right now they are very successful selling Airbuses because they're only one of two that can build long-range commercial airliners. As you noted there, India and Israel would also get into space. One of the problems we have today is there's so much junk going on in space that there's a danger that everyone's objects in space are going to get hit by somebody else's object in space. And the Air Force is constantly tracking thousands. They have a massive computer that tracks thousands of these pieces, even the junk that's circling the Earth. And there's a website somewhere you can get on and you can look at the number of objects in space and how many the Air Force is trying to track to make sure that the important defense satellites and the CIA satellites are not going to be destroyed in the process. So we'll stop here at the beginning of the jet age. We'll take a break. I'll give you a little bit extra time. So between now and 2:20, that's just about 22 and a half minute break. And then we'll start on the drone class.